Good afternoon. I'm Abby Wolf, the Executive Director of the Hutchins Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the last in our Alumni Fellows book series for this semester. This today caps the third remarkable semester in a series imagined and brought to life by Dr. Krishna Lewis, who directs our W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute Fellowship Program, but who unfortunately is not able to be here today. So I'm afraid you're stuck with me today. But I do want to thank Krishna for all that she's done to make this relatively new program in our portfolio possible. It's been a true bright spot in these times that we've all been experiencing together. I also want to thank our behind the scenes team, Tom Waleko, for his steady guidance throughout, along with the support of our Hutchins Center events team, Matt Weinberg and Justin Sneed. A few housekeeping details before we get to some introductions. There will be time for a Q&A session following the reading and conversation. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A, please send your name in a chat message to Hutchins Center host. I'll call on you when we commence Q&A, and you'll be asked to unmute and will appear on camera to engage with Professor Healy. With those important thanks and details behind me, let me take a moment to introduce you to our alumna fellow, Gaiutra Bahadur, who will be in discussion today with Thomas Healy, whose book Seoul City has brought us together this afternoon. Professor Bahadur is the author of Coolie Woman, The Odyssey of Indenture, a personal history of indenture, shortlisted in 2014 for the Orwell Prize, the British Literary Prize for Artful Political Writing. Her essays, literary criticism, and journalism have appeared in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, The Nation, Foreign Policy, and The Guardian, among other publications. The recipient of literary residencies from MacDowell and Italy's Bellagio Center, she's a two-time winner of the New Jersey State Council on the Arts Award for Prose. Her short fiction and essays have appeared in several collections of creative writing, including Nonstop Metropolis, a New York City Atlas, The Red Hen, Anthology of Contemporary Indian Writing, and Go Home. An assistant professor in the Department of Arts, Culture, and Media at Rutgers Newark, she was born in Guyana and immigrated as a child to the United States. Her current research examines side by side the deep histories and personal stories of slavery's and indentures descendants. It juxtaposes the stories of Guyanese immigrants to the United States and African-American exiles in Guyana in the late 20th century. Gaiutra holds an MS in journalism from Columbia and a BA in English literature from Yale. A former newspaper reporter, she has been a Nieman Fellow and a Hutchins Fellow at Harvard, and a scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and is an inaugural early career faculty fellow at the New Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers, where she is also the incoming director of the journalism program at Rutgers Newark. Both of these two individuals brought remarkable things to our fellowship program, and it's my pleasure right now to introduce to you Gaiutra Bahadur. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Abby, for the kind introduction, and hello, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to chat with Thomas Healy about his fascinating book, Seoul City, Race, Equality, and the Lost Dream of an American Utopia. So I first met Thomas in 2016 when we were fellows together at the Hutchins Center. We worked next to each other in a row of offices overlooking Grendel's Den. We've both had previous lives as daily newspaper reporters, and now we teach basically down the road from each other. Seton Law School, where Thomas teaches, is a few blocks away from the Rutgers Newark campus. And he's been kind enough to guest lecture to my journalism students about the First Amendment. And Thomas and I have been adjacent really in so many ways, physically and intellectually, and this event feels like a natural extension of that. It's my pleasure to introduce him. As a professor of law and as a writer and public intellectual, Thomas Healy produces knowledge and narrative about constitutional law, the freedom of speech, civil rights, and legal history. He is the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Great Dissent, about Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes's landmark opinion in support of the First Amendment, in a case involving Russian immigrants convicted under sedition laws. It was selected as a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and named by the Christian Science Monitor as one of the 15 best nonfiction books of 2013. It was praised by Publishers Weekly for its insightful forays into Holmes's personal psychology and as a fascinating look at how minds changed and how the world can change in turn. The Great Descent won the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. Thomas's work has been recognized with many prestigious awards and fellowships, including a Guggenheim and a public scholar grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. His essays and book reviews have appeared in The Atlantic, the New York Times, The Nation, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among other prominent publications. And his career has been as varied as it has been accomplished. After all, how many people can say that they've both worked as a lawyer on cases before the Supreme Court, as Thomas did as a litigator with the DC firm Sidley, Austin, Brown, and Wood, and covered the court as a correspondent, as he did for the Baltimore Sun. He began his newspaper career at the News and Observer in North Carolina, where he was born and raised, and where he earned his BA in journalism from UNC Chapel Hill, before going on to earn his JD at Columbia Law School. Soul City, his new book, takes him back to those roots, and it pays tribute to a forgotten civil rights leader he first heard about when he was a young reporter at the News and Observer in the 1990s. So Thomas is going to read a bit from the book, then I'll ask him for a few questions, and then you'll all have a chance to ask your own questions. Thomas?
Thanks, Gaiutra. It's great to see you. Great to see you, Abby. Great to see other people from the Hutchins Center today. It's really a thrill and an honor to be able to talk about this book at an event hosted by the Hutchins Center, since I probably wouldn't have finished this book had I not had the fellowship from the Hutchins Center, and which was such an incredible experience and really provided such deep knowledge for me that I could draw on in writing the book. That was in the fall of 2016. You may remember we had a presidential election that year, and we were all gathered together with Skip the day after that election, and it was a quite mournful atmosphere. And Skip was, I think he kind of comforted all of us and sort of led us to think that there was some hope, and sure enough, there was, because we're living in a different world. Well, not a different world, but at least under a different administration than we were then. So anyway, it's just really great to be here with all of you to talk about this book. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by reading just a brief excerpt from the book that hopefully will kind of situate it both sort of in terms of the precursors to Soul City, and I see there being a number of different kinds of precursors, and then and trying to really give you a sense of what Floyd McKissick's vision for Soul City was. This is an excerpt that comes out of the prologue, and here it goes. Soul City was not the first utopian venture to fall tragically short of its goals. It is the very nature of utopia that it can never be fully realized. And American history is littered with utopian experiments that began with giddy promise and ended in depressing failure, from the Shakers and other millenarian movements of the 19th century to the hippie communes and religious cults of the 20th. Nor was Soul City the first attempt to build a predominantly Black town that could serve as a means for economic advancement and a haven from racial oppression. Almost from the moment enslaved Africans were brought to the New World, they sought to create communities of solidarity and refuge. From the maroon settlements of North Carolina's Great Dismal Swamp to northern towns such as Brooklyn, Illinois, founded by free and fugitive Blacks in the 1820s. During the Civil War, the federal government aided these efforts, establishing freedmen's camps on plantations seized by Union troops. At Port Royal, South Carolina, more than 10,000 formerly enslaved people were provided land on which to harvest cotton, while at Davis Bend, Mississippi, Northern officers presided over a colony of freed Blacks that Ulysses S. Grant hoped would become a Negro paradise. These camps were broken up after the war when Andrew Johnson granted amnesty to Confederate leaders and restored seized property to Southern landowners. And for the next decade, as Reconstruction temporarily brought the freedmen new rights and a prominent role in Southern politics, the drive to establish separate Black communities stalled. But when Reconstruction ended in 1877 and a new era of racial terror dawned, Black people once again sought asylum from violence and economic subjugation. Between 1879 and 1881, more than 25,000 Blacks fled to Kansas as part of the Great Exodus. Settling on barren plains, they attempted to scratch out a life for themselves in towns such as Nicodemus, an unforgiving scrap of land said to have been named after an African prince brought to America in chains before purchasing his freedom. Many settlers lived in earthen dugouts with little food, little clothing, and little hope of supporting themselves. Gradually, as word spread that life there was grim and the future bleak, the stream of migrants to Nicodemus slowed. And when efforts to secure a railroad line failed, the flow reversed itself until hardly anyone remained in Nicodemus at all. It wasn't long before another mass migration began, this time to the Oklahoma Territory. Spurred by the opening of land to settlers in 1889, Black promoters began platting new towns and selling lots to Black people across the South. The most famous of these promoters, Edward Mccabe, left Nicodemus to found the town of Langston. Situated on a hill 40 miles northeast of Oklahoma City, Langston was one of the country's few successful Black settlements, reaching a population of 2,000 in 1891. But McCabe had grander ambitions than simply building a Black town. A prominent Republican and former Kansas state auditor, he wanted to transform Oklahoma into a Black state, with himself installed as governor. But the numbers were not on McCabe's side. In spite of his promotional efforts, Black settlers never accounted for more than a tenth of the territory's population. And when statehood came in 1907, Oklahoma passed a series of discriminatory laws and voting tests that all but ensured the disenfranchisement of its Black residents and the slow demise of its 30 or so Black towns. Seoul City had much in common with both of these traditions. Like its utopian precursors, it was born out of discontentment with the world as it existed and a desire to start over on a completely blank slate. Floyd McKissick wanted to build a new kind of city, one with a stronger sense of community, a deeper regard for the well-being of others, and a more egalitarian distribution of wealth. He also hoped to incorporate the latest innovations in social policy and urban design, boasting that Seoul City would be a showpiece of democracy in a sea of hypocrisy. But while many utopian communities had an abstract theoretical feel to them, Seoul City was a practical, hard-nosed endeavor. McKissick was not trying to achieve spiritual transcendence or the perfect relationship between man and nature. Unlike many utopian leaders of the 19th century, he did not aim to regulate every aspect of life in the community he was building. He did not want to eliminate sex or private property, as did the Shakers, or encourage open marriage like the Owenites. He did not promise lemonade seas and the extinction of mosquitoes, see the furorists. And he did not propose to build an elaborate palatial structure like the parallelogram designed by the reformer Robert Owen, or the phalansteries sketched by the French socialist Charles Fourier, self-contained cities in which groups of precisely 1,620 people would live and work in perfect harmony. Nor was McKissick interested in providing a sanctuary for those who wanted to turn on, tune in, and drop out, in the words of the psychedelic guru Timothy Leary. The people he recruited to build Seoul City were not hippies or beatniks. They were, for the most part, professionals, architects, engineers, project managers, accountants, doctors, and nurses. And if they were not professionals, they had to have some skill, some concrete contribution they could offer the fledgling community. In short, Although McKissick wanted to build a new kind of community, he also wanted to provide something vastly more straightforward for the residents of Seoul City, a chance at the American dream. There was a reason Black people were absent from the socialist utopias of the 19th century, and it wasn't just because they were being held in bondage. Even in the North, and even after the Civil War, most Blacks were indifferent to the message of the Shakers and Owenites, for the simple reason that they couldn't take for granted the very things those movements sought to escape: materialism, ownership of private property, and middle-class respectability. The same was true a century later when white suburban dropouts flocked to communes in California and New England. McKissick mocked what he regarded as the frivolousness of white culture, telling the graduating class of a historically Black college in 1969, "I thank God that Black kids today aren't swallowing goldfish or squeezing into phone booths or stealing panties and bras." Blacks had more pressing concerns, and so did McKissick. He wanted to take the American dream, the dream of opportunity, upward mobility, and self-determination, and make that dream available to a group of people to whom it had been denied. McKissick wasn't trying to create a place that didn't exist. The place he had in mind existed all around him. It just didn't exist for Black people. In that sense, Seoul City was closer in spirit to the tradition of Black towns. When Edward Mccabe founded Langston, he wasn't attempting to create a community for starry-eyed transcendentalists. Like McKissick, he hoped to build a town that would attract hardworking residents with traditional, even Victorian values. Nor did Black town developers shy away from the dictates of commerce, believing, again like McKissick, that manufacturing was the key to economic progress. The founders of Mound Bayou, a celebrated Black town in Louisiana, penned their hopes for success on a cottonseed oil mill, while officials in Boley, Oklahoma, invested in a brick factory and a carbonation works. The Black towns in Seoul City had something else in common. Both grew out of a larger vision of Black independence and Black nationalism. This vision was as old as slavery itself. It inspired Paul Cuffey's attempt to colonize Sierra Leone in 1811, Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement in the 1920s, and the so-called Republic of New Africa, a group of Black power advocates in the late 1960s who demanded that the federal government hand over 5 southern states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, along with $400 billion in cash. Often, the vision was about separation, about withdrawal from white society and the creation of a distinctive and self-sustaining Black nation. That was the message of a song about Boley, which at one point had a population of 7,000 and was the largest Black town in America. "Oh, 'tis a pretty country, and the Negroes own it too, with not a single white man here to tell us what to do." Sometimes, though, the vision entailed a reversal of fortunes, where Black was white and up was down, where those who had been high and mighty were brought down to size, and those who had been oppressed were cast in the role of oppressor. This was the world described by Langston Hughes in his sardonic poem, Cultural Exchange. Comes the colored hour. Martin Luther King as governor of Georgia, Dr. Rufus Clement his chief advisor, A. Philip Randolph the high grand worthy, in white pillared mansions, sitting on their wide verandas, wealthy Negroes have white servants, white sharecroppers work the Black plantations, and colored children have white mammies, Mammy Falbus, Mammy Eastland, Mammy Wallace, dear, dear, darling old white mammies, sometimes even buried with our family. There was certainly an element of this vision in McKissick's dream. By establishing his city on a former slave plantation, by taking ownership of the big house, by naming the whole enterprise Seoul City, he signaled the satisfaction he took in turning the tables, in flipping the script of American history. But he also made clear that he wanted Seoul City to be more than an inversion of white supremacy. As his good friend, the author John Oliver Killens wrote in Black Man's Burden, Black people were not simply waiting for the day we can assume the role the white man played for centuries. Instead, McKissick hoped to set an example of how one race, finding itself in a position of power, could treat another race with respect and fairness. We do not intend to adopt the white man's racism, he told the press in describing his venture. Seoul City will be an attempt to move into the future, a future where Black people welcome white people as equals.
Thanks, Thomas. That prologue does such a brilliant job of setting Seoul City in the context of a couple of different builder and dreamer traditions. And it actually leads perfectly into my first question. So as a charismatic leader of the Congress of Racial Equality, Floyd McKissick played such a pivotal role in the Freedom Rider campaigns and the civil rights movement more broadly, but his legacy is not very well known. You painted a vivid picture of his role in the March Against Fear in Mississippi in 1966. And there's a photograph in the book of McKissick walking between Martin Luther King Jr. and Stokely Carmichael, the three men linked arm in arm. And I think in his approach to the struggle for civil rights, he was probably wedged between these two polar icons, in between figuratively as well as physically. And the violence the police unleashed against the marchers, which was comparable in scale to that against the marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, changed that. So McKissick was knocked off a truck with a gas canister in this attack. And you tell us that he emerged from this encounter embracing Black power much more clearly and forcefully than ever. And in a sense, it radicalized him. So my question is, should we read him as a radical figure in the pantheon of 20th century African-American civil rights leaders? And I'm particularly interested in his idea of Black capitalism and his vision of Seoul City as an embodiment of that. The radical Black intellectual tradition through the work of thinkers such as Cedric Robinson, Eric Williams, and Robin D.G. Kelley is to see capitalism as conjoined with racism, right? Or as Kelley has put it, there's no such thing as non-racial capitalism. So how did McKissick reconcile his belief in capitalism with his belief in Black power? And for good measure, how did he reconcile his drive for Black self-determination with courting and campaigning for Richard Nixon, right? So I was surprised to learn from your book that Jet magazine actually once described Nixon as the GOP's civil rights workhorse.
Yeah, that's something that most people don't think about when they think about Nixon now. Nixon, the crusader for civil rights. Really excellent question, Gaiutra, and I don't know that I can do justice to it. I will try, and I hope that you will chime in to sort of help me think through some of these questions. First and foremost, should we see McKissick as a radical figure? I think absolutely we should see McKissick as a radical figure, because radical doesn't just imply that your approach or your prescription for all problems is leftist in nature. I mean, I think he's radical in the sense that he's radically trying to reimagine what equality looks like. And the way he's trying to go about that is truly radical in the maybe the kind of the purest meaning of the term: ambitious, bold, path-breaking, sort of, almost unthinkable. I mean, here he is, in his attempt to try to create true equality for African Americans. He comes up with the idea of building a city of 50,000 people out of nothing but the red dirt of one of the poorest parts of North Carolina, which is one of the poorest parts of the country at the time. So I absolutely think that that he is radical, and that he, like many other Black leaders, had come to see the kind of incrementalist approach of a lot of the civil rights movement as simply not sufficient to accomplish the job. I mean, McKissick's evolution, from 1960, when he's the sort of main lawyer for the protesters sitting in at the Woolworths in Greensboro, and demanding integration, to the later part of the 1960s, where he's preaching Black power louder than almost anyone, And now Martin Luther King is starting to say, hey, I don't know, I can't come to CORE's national conference because you guys are a little too out there for me. I mean, I think it kind of encapsulates the movement itself. I mean, his trajectory, in other words, really sort of mirrors the trajectory of the movement, beginning with this, this very kind of concrete goal of freedom and integration, and expanding out to a much larger, more ambitious, radical goal of true Black equality. Now, where he departs from other leaders on the radical side, I think, is in his prescription. And his prescription does have a kind of conservative aspect to it, right? Working within the establishment rather than trying to overthrow or subvert the establishment. I think a lot of that comes down to his personality and to who he was and where he came from. McKissick was essentially a middle class, he grew up as a middle class kid. I mean, Black middle class meant something different than white middle class. But his father was a bellhop at a prominent hotel in Asheville. His mother worked in a kind of administrative secretarial capacity at North Carolina Mutual, the largest Black insurance company in the country, for many years. He grew up in a kind of middle class neighborhood. I mean, maybe his family was sort of clinging to the middle class, but it was nonetheless sort of middle class. He went to law school. He was a practicing attorney. He had, he was trying to develop wealth like other middle class people through the purchase of real estate. And I think that that kind of middle class sensibility probably influenced the approach that he took and the prescription that he embraced for what was a rather radical diagnosis. And he also has just a really pragmatic streak about him, as exemplified by his willingness to team up with the Republican Party and Richard Nixon. And I think he was interested in, he was certainly interested in the intellectual side of equality, and he was not naive, and he knew about the deep connection between slavery and capitalism, and racism and capitalism. Frantz Fanon was one of his favorite authors, but his response was, his hope was that Black capitalism would be different than white capitalism, that white capitalism was about oppression, and that Black capitalism would be about expanding opportunity. And he was even uncomfortable with that word capitalism. He preferred the term entrepreneurialism, and there were even some kind of socialist, I don't know if socialist is the right word, but some sort of socialist wealth redistribution aspects to his plan in Seoul City. He wanted to create these worker trusts that would basically share in the profits of these companies. At least theoretically, that was his idea. But more than anything, he wanted to do something that would work. And I think he just viewed working within the establishment, trying to create wealth through the established mechanisms for creating wealth, as a much more pragmatic, doable, solution than, overthrowing the entire capitalist system.
Right. And he even used the term, I think, radical capitalism, right, when he was conceptualizing these worker trusts. But it's interesting in terms of the American dream, if you look at it generationally, right? You told us what McKissick's parents, what their lives were like. His son, Floyd McKissick Jr., is a former state senator, right? And a state government official in North Carolina, is that right?
Yes, and a practicing attorney.
Right, yeah.
And just, not to interrupt, but all of his children have advanced degrees, and there's very much a kind of talented 10th aspect, to his upbringing, and I think that was something that was really sort of driven home to him by his parents and his wife's family as well. I don't think it would be fair, though, to to characterize McKissick as only concerned with the advancement of an elite. I think, his work at CORE and his work in building Seoul City was designed to address the problems of poor people. I mean, that was made very clear. When he took over CORE, he really shifted the focus of CORE, from questions of integration to questions of housing and job opportunity, and wasn't called food security then, but the equivalent of food security, and basically just dealing with the problems that African American people faced in the ghettos that they were relegated to in the cities. So I think it was tempting for some people to think that because McKissick wanted to work within the capitalist system, that he was really only concerned with the advancement of a kind of elite or even middle class Black community. I don't frankly think that's a fair characterization of what he was trying to do.
And despite his pragmatism and his vision, in the end, it didn't work out. Originally, the plan was to have 18,000 residents, and I think by 2020 it's at 50,000, but there really only were ever about 200, I think. So you write that your goal in telling the story of Seoul City is not to assign blame, but to understand the forces that led to its downfall and the lessons it offers for the pursuit of racial equality today. And of course, the struggle for racial justice continues. The uprisings of the past few years and the killings by police that sparked them are pretty stark reminders of that. The wealth gap between Black and white Americans, which McKissick saw as the problem he hoped Seoul City would solve, persists today. And I was fascinated to learn recently of efforts currently underway to build a Black city called Freedom in Georgia. I'm wondering, why did Seoul City fail? And I know that's a very big question, and you've written an entire book to answer it, but what lessons do you think this failure might offer to the architects of this new venture?
Thanks. Yeah, obviously it's a big question, but I'm happy to try to tackle it. You quote a line from the book where I say I'm not, my goal isn't to assign blame, it's to understand why Seoul City failed. At least one reviewer took issue with that line, that my goal wasn't to assign blame. I really should have written my goal wasn't merely to assign blame, because I think the book assigns quite a lot of blame and makes very clear what forces killed Seoul City. And that really was my goal to understand. And what I really didn't want to do was write a book trying to assign blame to McKissick, and pointing out, things that he could have done differently to succeed. The biggest challenge that McKissick faced, it's just this huge paradox or catch-22, is that he was trying to achieve self-sufficiency for Black people, but the only way to do that was to first rely for money on the very institutions that he was trying to seek, that he was trying to sort of escape from, having to depend on. What the story demonstrates is you really cannot pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It is not possible. It has to come from somewhere, right? I mean, there were no resources within the Black community to help fund Seoul City. Everything that he needed to build Seoul City, he had to go to, to the institutions of power, which were, of course, all controlled by whites, corporations, the federal government, the media, to fairly and accurately present what he was doing. And what I think the book shows is that at each turn, those institutions were, if not outwardly hostile to what he was trying to achieve, at a minimum, deeply skeptical and deeply reluctant to support this effort that he had undertaken. And so you start off with him having to go to the federal government for money. I mean, now there was a federal program that that white developers were relying upon to build new communities. And there was this big push in the country for new communities at the time, and Congress was supporting it. But McKissick was warned by developers of other communities that were relying upon private funds that, look, if you rely on the government, it's going to be very hard, because there's a level of caution and bureaucracy that is really going to hamstring you. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. I mean, a huge portion of the story is a story about the bureaucratic obstacles that he faces, which are nearly insuperable. But there was also lots of explicit hostility. Jesse Helms, who plays a big role in the book, clearly his motivations here were racist, and his racist history is well known, and he was deeply hostile to Seoul City and did everything in his power to stop it. The media played a big role in killing Seoul City, and we can talk about that in more detail. But I think what the story demonstrates is that it's very hard to achieve self-sufficiency without first having some support to get there. And if you're having to rely on institutions and a structure that is basically kind of created to keep you in a subordinate position, then it's going to be really hard, if not impossible. And I wish that that lesson was a more hopeful lesson. But I think we have to be frank. We have to be really honest. That was those were the odds that he was up against, and I think those are still the kind of structural forces that stand in the way of true equality, and that stand in the way of a community like this community in Georgia, Freedom, which is trying to emulate on a smaller scale some of what McKissick was trying to do.
And maybe it's worth pointing out also that 13 new towns were funded under the New Communities Act of '68, right? And 12 of them failed. So actually only one succeeded. But I'm glad you raised the question of the media, because I do want to ask you about that. You first learned about McKissick as a reporter at the News and Observer, right? So what you didn't know at the time was that the newspaper had been something of an antagonist for Seoul City. One of their star reporters, Pat Stith, had written a damning series of articles about the town, suggesting that McKissick was enriching himself and his family and misusing these funds from the federal government. And editor Claude Seton, who's a legendary reporter with a national reputation, who'd returned to the News and Observer from the New York Times and was really kind of revered as a journalistic ally of the civil rights movement. He wrote scathingly about the project as a blow to the fight for integration. So another NNO News and Observer reporter, Nicole Hannah-Jones, is among several prominent journalists of color who are currently recasting traditional journalistic notions of objectivity as a default to whiteness, right? She recently told NPR's 1A podcast that, quote, mainstream media have long operated as stenographers of power, and we've taken that to be non-biased, objective reporting. So when white Americans say to me, I just want factual reporting, what they're saying to me is they want reporting from a white perspective, from a white normative view, and that simply has never been the objective. So I'm just wondering, do you think this analysis is at all useful in helping us understand the coverage of Seoul City by both the News and Observer and the national press? And how do you make sense of the coverage? How does it fit into the larger historical context?
Yeah, absolutely. And having worked at newspapers, I thought about this a lot as I was writing this book, because the newspaper in Raleigh played such a critical role in Seoul City's ultimate demise. And I was so frustrated, as I went back and I read the coverage, which in my view is not objective at all. I mean, objective in the sense of trying to present a true and full picture of what is going on. It was written like an indictment. I mean, this was like the way a prosecutor would present a case, not the way somebody who's actually trying to objectively describe the world would present a case. And I think that, there's a sense in newsrooms, and I think that the reporter in this case, his name's Pat Stith, someone that I knew when I worked at the newspaper. I was there, a few decades after this story, but he was still at the newspaper, and I knew him, and I talked to him about the book. I interviewed him, and we talked about this, and I find that lots of reporters have a very kind of narrow understanding of what objectivity is. That as long as they don't have any factual misstatements, then that's objective. And it's just not the case. The question is, does this accurately reflect the world, right? And if a public figure states something that's just factually incorrect, and you report that, and then you say, and other people disagree, you're not objectively reporting the world. You're just suggesting that this is something up for grabs. And I think journalists are scared oftentimes to be objective, to actually accurately, faithfully portray what's going on. Now, I don't know if fear was at issue here. I don't think it was. I think that if you're an investigative reporter, what you're looking for is scandal, and where you look, you will find scandal. And Pat Stith looked here, and he thought he found scandal. He thought he found corruption. He thought he found nepotism that was unlawful. He thought he found mismanagement of funds. He thought he found, quid pro quo between Richard Nixon and Floyd McKissick, money for Seoul City in exchange for McKissick support. And the fact of the matter is that he didn't. It wasn't there. And we know it wasn't there because after his stories came out, Jesse Helms got the General Accounting Office of Congress to do an audit. They spent the better part of a year, millions of dollars of money, dozens of auditors down on site going through all the books. And what did they find? Nothing. They found some unallowable expenses. Do you know what that means? That means that they didn't always accurately fill out their expense reports. I worked at a newspaper. I know the kind of creative writing that goes into filling out your expense reports, right? If not filling out your expense reports perfectly was a federal crime, then every reporter in the country would be in jail. And when I asked Pat Stith about this, he stood by the story. He said, well, is there anything untrue in there? The fact of the matter is there were lots of false statements, which I catalog. But more than that, there were just tons of material omissions, and there was lacking any context to what the New Communities Act passed by Congress was designed to do, to the kinds of problems in the cities that McKissick was responding to the kinds of obstacles that he faced, and to the kind of progress that he was actually making. I mean, never once in these stories did the News and Observer make clear that only a year before had McKissick gotten the federal loan guarantee that was being used to fund Seoul City. The newspaper kept describing it as a project that had been in the works for 6 years, and then said he got $19 million from the federal government when the bulk of that money hadn't even been made available to him until a year prior. So no, there was not objectivity. And yes, Nicole Hannah-Jones is completely right about this. There were no Black reporters at the News and Observer at the time. I'm almost positive. It was hard to verify that for sure. I'm almost positive there were no Black reporters at the News and Observer in 1975. So is it any surprise that no one in the newsroom said, hey, maybe we should think twice about this. Maybe we should investigate more broadly and see whether we're accurately portraying this. And the thing, obviously I'm worked up about this, is it obvious? But the thing that makes me so angry is, you'll see these critiques of the New York Times. Oh, the New York Times is, being controlled by woke Black reporters now. No, the fact of the matter is, though, there are actually some Black journalists at the New York Times now who can push back and who can raise these kinds of questions. And so the management of the Times has to actually respond to that. Whereas 30 or 40 years ago, there were no prominent, well-known Black reporters who could make those kinds of arguments. That's not being under the control of woke Black reporters. That's just more accurately representing the community that you're reporting on.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we have time for questions from the audience.
We do. I'm going to start off while people are formulating their questions. That was, I mean, both of you, thank you so much for bringing a perspective that we don't always get. I mean, the journalistic perspective is so important to everything we do. But I have a couple of questions. I will admit I had not heard of Freedom, Georgia before either of you mentioned it. So I quickly looked it up, and for whatever Wikipedia is worth, I learned that it was established last fall in the wake of the, George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery murders, as well as others. And it was created by 19 African-American families who purchased the land. And I'm wondering, in some ways, perhaps that's not correct. And if it's not correct, then please, if either of you has better information, please share it. But I'm wondering if, it's obviously, 50 or so years later, after Seoul City was created, after this federal program existed. But I'm wondering if this establishment of Freedom, Georgia, whether it's symbolic or not, does it realize some of what McKissick wanted? I mean, there's a self-determination about that act of 19 families getting together to purchase the land. So I guess my larger question, to bring it back to your book specifically, would be, is there any hope that comes out of your book? Have any of what the principles that he founded Seoul City on, have any of them been realized? And do they point to, a more hopeful direction? I don't know. Hopeful is such a silly word to use, but I'm just wondering what you make of that, of the establishment of that town, and how some of his principles that it was founded on may be seen in different ways today.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think freedom is a very intriguing initiative. And I do think that, it sort of grows out of this same tradition. And McKissick's effort to build Seoul City was part of a tradition, right? And that's, part of why I wanted to read that excerpt, is to show that, this is a tradition. This is not just something that, he dreams up out of the blue. There's a long history of oppressed groups, and in particular, Black people in this country, seeking a kind of haven and a refuge from oppression. I do think that, to the extent that McKissick had a dream and articulated that dream, and that dream is compelling, that by itself, does have a kind of inspiring quality that I think that has value, right? So, yes, it's a dream unfulfilled, but even unfulfilled dreams have power. And they, and even trying to seek sort of, utopia has value, because it helps to demonstrate the gap between what is and what we think should be. There's a brilliant book about utopias that I read as a part of my research, called Paradise Now, that really just makes this point so eloquently, that there's real value. We don't have a lot of utopian thinking in our current age, but in the 19th century, utopia just loomed very large in the kind of public consciousness, and we've lost that to some degree. And I think the point of that book, and one thing that we could take away from this book is, there's value in that, and to keep pursuing the dream, even if it's unattainable. In the book, there's references to Man of La Mancha, in the song "The Impossible Dream," because that's what the choir sang at the groundbreaking of Seoul City. And in many ways, this was, a kind of impossible dream, but that doesn't make it not worth seeking. You know, I want to say one other thing about this and sort of what the goal is in these kinds of efforts, you know, and it's self-sufficiency, for sure. It's also, I think, about making the world look less like a white world. You know, McKissick wrote in his unfinished autobiography that from the time he was 4 or 5 and basically became aware of the fact that he was a Black person, you know, that he felt like he was a Black boy in a white land. And there's 2 aspects to that. There's he was a Black boy, you know, and you could resolve the conflict there by changing who you are, by changing your identity, or you could solve it by changing what the land is that you live in, you know, and making it less a white land. And I think that was part of the goal. I think, you know, McKissick wanted to create a place that just wasn't so white. You know, I mean, that's why he called it Seoul City. And that's why he refused to change the name, even though he made every other compromise under the world, because his goal was to make the world less white. And he wanted to do that at a scale that was large enough to make a difference. You know, you could say, well, you know, you could live in a Black neighborhood, or you could go to a historically Black college, or you could have a Black business, you know. But I think McKissick thought, no, all of those things are still operating within a larger Black context, you know, and short of creating an entire Black nation, you know, what could you do in the United States? Well, you can't create a Black state. That didn't work. You could create a Black city, you know, and I think he wanted to create that, and he wanted to show too that was also American. You know, that America was not just a white place, but that America could be a Black place as well.
You'd think I would remember to unmute after all these months, but thank you very much. That was a more expansive answer than perhaps my question than one would have thought I would have gotten. But we do have a couple of audience questions. So Paul Richardson is up first.
Hi, well, there's an A and B to this. Did you think he ever reflected back and thought capitalism was not the right system, you know, including his pragmatism? And then a follow-up to that real quick is, how did he reconcile his influence of Fanon with what his objectives were?
Those are great questions. And, you know, I didn't find any evidence that he later in life second guessed what he was trying to do. You know, he continued to say, you know, up until he died, that, you know, he still believed in Seoul City. He still believed that he was on to something. And so I don't see any evidence, and it may just be because, you know, again, he was a very pragmatic, practical person. And I think, you know, if you think that that there's inequality, economic inequality, and you think that, look, there's 2 ways we could deal with this. We could overturn capitalism, or we could change capitalism to make it work for all people. You know, it's hard to say. I mean, you know, they're both hard. They're both, you know, maybe impossible. But maybe one of those looks more doable, or at least maybe you think that you can achieve more change through the route that McKissick chose. But again, I don't have evidence that he really, you know, reflected on this later in his life. How did he reconcile, you know, his you know, admiration and agreement with Fanon with what he was trying to do? And maybe it's a question of diagnosis versus prescription. I mean, maybe he agreed entirely with Fanon's diagnosis, but disagreed with the prescription, and thought that you know, that it wasn't. You might think that capitalism lends itself to oppression, and that it lends itself to being, used in a way that oppresses people on the basis of race, and yet still think that it's not inevitable, that it can be reformed, essentially. And I have to think that that's how he reconciled it. I frankly, I never came across, any conversations he had or any anything he wrote in which he tried to reconcile his support for Fanon with his embrace of entrepreneurialism or Black capitalism, if that's what you want to call it. But I think that's how you would have to try to reconcile it, is to say, well, it's not beyond all hope or all redemption, that it could be used and leveraged to provide economic opportunity for all people.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Or I don't want to jump. Jump the queue.
Yes, you can ask a question.
What
Please.
had he succeeded? Could he have succeeded? A. And had he succeeded, where would Black America be in 2021? That's A, B, and then C. This dream of, the nation within a nation, owning land, right, goes back to the fact that 90% of all Black people until 1910 lived in not only in the South, but there were majorities in South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and almost a majority in Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. So is that where this idea comes from? I mean, is ultimately ownership of land tied to vote and self-determination and semi-independence, like a canton in Switzerland or something? Can you unpack that for me?
Yeah, sure. I can try. So could it have succeeded? I think it could have. Was it likely to succeed? Probably not, but lots of things that aren't likely come to pass, right? And there were lots of obstacles. But one of the towns that was funded with money from Congress did succeed, the Woodlands outside of Houston. It might not have faced all of the obstacles Seoul City faced, in part because the developer was an oil magnate who had his own resources to contribute, in part because the federal government invested 10 times more money in that community, $50 million as opposed to the $10 million in loan guarantees that McKissick ultimately got. So I think it was possible. There were other new towns that were developed around the same time: Reston in Virginia, Columbia, Maryland, Irvine in Southern California. We have to imagine lots of things breaking his way. We have to imagine that there isn't a recession in 1973, and this kind of combination of low growth and high inflation that makes any kind of large scale real estate development nearly impossible. We have to imagine that Jesse Helms has maybe less influence, or that the News and Observer is less opposed to this. But he got a lot further than a lot of people thought he could get. And he, along the way, and this is actually to go back to Abby's question about, is there anything hopeful? He attracted a lot of white allies for this project. He got a lot of people on board who were initially skeptical, local officials and local business leaders in Warren County and in the state. I mean, the governor of North Carolina shows up at this groundbreaking and gives this JFK-like talk about, how McKissick is like the, people landing on the moon. So I think he could have succeeded. What would America look like now? I mean, you are as equipped as I am. You're certainly more equipped, I think, to answer that question. My own view is that, first of all, it would have made clear that integration can look a lot of different ways, right? And that was one of the things that really angered McKissick, is that people could only understand integration where it was 80% white and 20% Black. But a community that was 80% Black and 20% white is equally integrated. So why can't that be an integrated community? That would have been, I think, pretty important on its own. I mean, Claude Seton, who was the editor of the News and Observer and who was opposing Seoul City, he was also opposing historically Black colleges, right? Because they didn't fit with his view of integration. And so I think it would have done that. I think it would have made clear that just because there are a majority of Black people, in an enterprise, it doesn't mean that it's separatist. It might have also paved the way for other developments like this. And I think McKissick thought that it would have huge symbolic value, that it would demonstrate that Black people could achieve something truly monumental. Now, the flip side of that is if he fails, does that say anything about the inabilities of Black people? And obviously, I think some people took that lesson from it, which is an unfair lesson. But I think McKissick, that's why he wanted the name Seoul City, because he wanted this to stand as a monument to what Black people could do. And I think he wanted people to see that there could be a place, where Black people were in the majority and where Black people had economic opportunity, and that this was also America. So I think that's, those are some of the things that would have been gained and how America might look different today. Do I think it would look radically different? No, I don't think it would look radically different. I mean, this was just one of a number of things that needed to be done. And then where does this idea come from? I mean, yeah, I think you're onto something when you talk about ownership of land and self-determination. I mean, McKissick has this great line. He's very provocative. He has this great line on the anniversary on Lincoln's birthday, when he's introducing his plan for radical capitalism, and he says Lincoln didn't free the slaves; he fired them, meaning that under slavery, Black labor was being exploited, but at least like white people had a use for Black people. Whereas, after the end of Jim Crow, I mean, I think Michelle Alexander makes this argument brilliantly in The New Jim Crow, basically white, institutions say, well, we have no real use for Black people. We don't need your labor anymore. So might as well just incarcerate you. Even though it's obviously far more expensive to do that than to provide decent housing. But I think, that comes back to this question of having self-determination, not depending upon, what white people want to do with you, but being able to determine what you're going to do with yourself, and property plays a big role in that. Black people were denied the ability to own property, and we know that the Black-white wealth gap is, largely attributable to the fact that there are all sorts of government policies that prevented Black people from buying homes and building equity and then passing that down to their descendants. So yeah, I think property plays a huge role in this.
Do you have time for one more question?
I do.
Audience?
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I have another Zoom I have to jump onto. But a great introduction, great presentation. Nice to see old friends again. Anyway.
Thank you so much, Skip. It's great to see you.
Okay, bye-bye.
So a question came in from Ramona Page Berman, and she put it in the chat. So I'm just going to read it, but it dovetails very well with this question of property ownership, land ownership. She's asking, what was the topography of the land? Were there roads linked to highways? Was there any plan to have farming as an integrated part of the city plans? In other words, how good of an urban planned community was it?
Great question. And I should note that we have in the presentation today, Lou Myers, who was one of the key members of McKissick's staff, and knows all of this much more firsthand than I do. in lots of ways, I think this was a brilliant location for a new community. Now, it had some downsides. It wasn't adjacent to any kind of existing community, which meant that you had to build everything from scratch: the economic base, the jobs, the infrastructure, the housing, et cetera. That was the real challenge. The advantages were, yes, there were two major highways that ran very close to the property. I-95, the major northwest corridor on the East Coast, ran about 25 miles to the east. I-85, which is a really important interstate highway in the southeast that goes from, I think, Alabama to Virginia, basically ran right by the property. I mean, you could throw a rock from the property and hit cars going down I-85. There was a major rail line, freight rail line that went right past the property. Again, it was actually in between I-85 and the property. There were abundant natural resources, a big lake that could be used for water, and a relatively buildable land, kind of rolling hills. Some of it was wooded, but some of the land had been cleared for timber. Urban planners who looked at it at the time from UNC said, "Oh, this is an ideal place to build a new community." Also, sort of midway between Raleigh-Durham and Richmond, Virginia. You have to remember too, Research Triangle Park, which is the big kind of tech area in North Carolina, is an hour or so south of Seoul City, and was kind of really starting to come into its own at this time. So I think from an urban planning perspective, they did all the work they needed to do. They had the help of lots of professionals, in that field. I don't know that there was much plan to have farming. I mean, they were using the land that they bought. They were using some of it for farming, but mostly this was going to be a manufacturing community. This is at a time when a lot of manufacturing was moving from the north to the south. North Carolina was a big destination for a lot of that manufacturing. And the view was that if we just get some of that manufacturing that's coming to North Carolina anyway, that will be sufficient for our job base. One question that obviously raises is, well, what would have happened as manufacturing left the South and went abroad? And that certainly would have been another challenge that would have had to have been faced. But other communities in the South have found a way to deal with that, and I expect Seoul City would have as well.
Thank you. I think we have to let you go now. You've graciously stayed with us a few extra minutes, but thank you so much. And this talk makes me think about Charles Blow's call to African Americans to move back to the South, what it would mean to move back to a South that has many Black mayors now. And of course, in northern cities, there are also a lot of Black mayors who my history of Black mayors isn't so great, but I don't think there were so many in 1969, certainly not in major urban centers. So I guess I want to think that there is something that's come from that, come out of this, that some good lessons learned and good things to build on. And there is a question in the chat that we can't get to, but that fruitful, to use Annabelle Slingerland's word, some fruitful developments as well. But thank you so much. Thanks to both of you for closing out our semester and spending this time with us and bringing your brilliance to us. We really appreciate it. And I wish all of you happy holidays. So bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Gaiutra. Thank you, Abby.
Bye-bye.
Take care.